The day Angela Miller found the dog tags, she wasn't looking for anything. It was early March in Montana, the kind of morning where the air felt suspended in a dull gray hush. A thin veil of fog rolled off the foothills and hung over the Bitterroot Valley like a breath that hadn't quite exhaled. She was renovating the fireplace. Not because it needed it, but because after 6 years in the house, she still hadn't made peace with the cold silence it radiated. There was something about the room that unsettled her, especially when the nights were long and the power flickered. Something in the way the chimney seemed to hold its breath. The Granger house, they called it. She hadn't known the full story when she bought it. Just a rumor that a family once lived there, that one day they were simply gone, disappeared. No warning, no reason, no trace. The house had passed through 3 owners since 2004, each staying for less time than the last. Angela was the only one who didn't leave. Until now, she hadn't given the rumors much weight. But that changed when she pulled a scorched, metallic object from behind a loose fire brick. It was wedged deep, coated in soot. Angela thought it was a coin at first, but when she brushed off the ash, she saw the engraving. Granger, Matthew Air, Oppose, USMC. She turned it over with trembling fingers. The back was burned. But one word was still legible. Family. Sank 3. When Detective Alan Whitlow got the call, he almost didn't believe it. 16 years. That's how long the Granger file had sat in the cold case locker of the Missoula County Sheriff's Department. He'd been a rookie in 2004, his first real missing persons case. He remembered the details like they were tattooed into his brain: a father, a mother, 2 young children, a Thursday night dinner half-eaten on the table, a front door locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Just 4 people gone. It was a case that kept him up at night, not just for the mystery, but for the silence that followed, the lack of evidence. The way the house just sat there, still and waiting, like it had swallowed them whole and was content to keep the secret. Now here it was, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. Granger. And the dog tags? They weren't found in the yard, or the shed, or a forgotten drawer. They were found inside the chimney. The house sat at the end of a long gravel road that wound through Douglas fir and juniper pines. The mailbox was rusted. The windows wore the dust of years. Whitlow stood on the front porch, staring up at the brick chimney like it might speak. Angela met him at the door. She looked tired, like someone who'd been holding in a scream for far too long. "I didn't even know what it was," she said. "Just felt something catch on my glove when I pulled it out." She trailed off. He followed her inside. The living room still had that 90s aesthetic floral borders, brass fixtures, popcorn ceiling. But something felt off, like the air was too dense. Angela showed him the fireplace. It was a wide hearth, red brick with a faux oak mantel. She pointed to the lower left corner where a brick had been loosened during her work. Whitlow leaned in, pulled on gloves, and reached into the gap. The soot was deep, black and clotted, like something had been burned there that wasn't supposed to be. He found a second object, a child's keychain, shaped like a bear, melted on one side. Avaruker. The forensics team arrived 2 hours later. The chimney was scanned with thermal imaging. They found what appeared to be a hollowed cavity behind the flue literally the size of a shoebox, sealed with insulation, filled with ash and fabric fragments. Every item was bagged, labeled, and sent to the lab. But the real question wasn't what was found. It was why it was hidden. Who burned the items? And why place them in the chimney? End of 2. Matthew Granger had served 2 tours in Iraq. A decorated Marine, disciplined, private, not known to be sociable but respectful. His wife Lillian worked as a nurse at the local clinic, known for her kindness. The children, Evan and Chloe, were well liked. Smart, polite. Evan had just made the honor roll. Nothing in the family's profile suggested trouble. But then again, nothing in their disappearance had ever made sense. The last known sighting was at the grocery store on a Monday afternoon. A receipt showed milk, cereal, and a dog bone. Surveillance footage confirmed all 4 family members were present. After that, nothing. No calls. No notes. No bodies. The house was found 4 days later during a welfare check, everything still in place. Food in the fridge, Lillian's purse on the counter, Evan's backpack leaning against the coat rack. The only thing missing was them. Whitlow drove home that night with the dog tags on the seat beside him. He kept glancing over like they might vanish again. He'd worked dozens of disappearances in his career, some with messy endings, others with no endings at all. But the Granger case? It was the one that haunted him. A family disappearing is not like a person disappearing. It changes the landscape. It leaves a void that others feel, even if they didn't know them personally. The neighbors still talked about it. Kids dared each other to touch the mailbox. Some locals believed it was aliens. Others whispered about cults. But most simply filed it away under that unspoken drawer marked too sad to think about. Now, something had surfaced. Adopté. Melted. Hidden. Placed. Which meant someone was trying to bury the truth. And for the first time in 16 years, Alan Whitlow had a lead. For a second. Angela didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt like breath on her neck. Every gust through the chimney made her skin crawl. She'd bought the home as a fresh start, a place to heal. She was divorced, childless, and ready to write a new chapter. But now, the past of this place was bleeding through the walls. She stood in front of the hearth at midnight, staring into the darkness. And then she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint smell, not of soot, not of wood, but something else, like burned cloth or hair. She turned away, heart pounding, and that's when she saw it scratched faintly into the stone of the mantel. Letters, barely visible. She leaned closer. It said, Chloe. Dak. The next morning, Whitlow brought in the crime scene photographer. They dusted the mantel, found fragments of fingernail near the engraving. The depth of the carving suggested small hands. A child. They photographed every inch of the chimney's interior. And then just before noon, one of the techs found it. Another object, deep behind the flue, ash-coated. When it was pulled out and cleaned, it revealed a second tag. Smaller, brighter. Name Chloe Granger. Blood-stained and scorched. Simzaker. By the time the press got wind of it, Whitlow had already requested the Granger house be sealed. He wasn't ready for headlines. Not yet. Not until he understood the how, the who, the why. Because if the chimney held evidence, then what else had this house been keeping quiet? 16 years. And now, the walls were speaking. But Whitlow knew from experience, sometimes the answers buried in ash are worse than the questions. See, it wasn't supposed to be a permanent place. When Matthew and Lillian Granger moved into the house at the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, it was meant to be a stepping stone. Just a few years, they told themselves. Save some money. Get the kids through elementary school. Then maybe Missoula, or even out of state. But that never happened. The house on Bristlecone Road became more than a home. It became a question that no one could answer. And, for the people of Florence, Montanate became something else entirely. A ghost. End of. In 2004, Florence was the kind of town you could miss if you blinked while driving through it. A gas station, a diner, a post office, a population just shy of 800. It wasn't the place where bad things happened, at least not to entire families. The Grangers fit in quickly. Matthew, a quiet but capable man in his mid-30s, was the kind of father who knew how to fix a bike chain with one hand and hold a Labrador leash in the other. Lillian, outgoing and bright, worked 3 shifts a week at the regional health clinic and still made it to every PTA meeting. The children, Evan and Chloe, were inseparable. She, the artistic one, always drawing suns and horses. He, the thinker, obsessed with puzzles and rocks. The house they rented sat on an acre of land, hemmed in by tall pine and a fence that leaned just enough to look neglected. It was a little too far from town to walk, and just far enough from the neighbors for privacy to become silence. That summer everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Ida. The last confirmed sighting of the Granger family came on a Monday evening, the 16th of August, 2004. A surveillance camera at Dixon's General Store caught them entering around 6:42 p.m. Matthew picked up firewood and 2 cans of chili. Lillian bought milk and a dog bone. Chloe reached for a candy bar at the checkout, but Lillian gently pulled her hand back. The clerk remembered Evan saying, "Can we build a fire tonight?" That was it. The next day, no one saw them. And the day after that. And the day after that. End quote. On Friday, the 20th of August at 8:17 a.m., neighbor Janice Lowell called the sheriff's office. "I haven't seen the Granger kids at the bus stop. Not since Monday," she said. "I know it's summer, but something feels off." Deputy Whitlow, just 2 years on the force, was sent to check it out. He parked outside the house, noticing nothing strange at first. The family's SUV was in the driveway. A child's bike leaned against the fence. The grass hadn't been mowed in a week, but it was late summer. Everything was dry and slow. He knocked. No answer. Again. Nothing. Through the window he could see the living room. Tidy. A folded blanket on the couch. A coffee mug on the side table. Curtains drawn. He circled the perimeter. No broken glass. No forced entry. Then he looked through the back door, where a pane of glass had a small crack. Inside, the dining table was set. 4 plates. Forks neatly arranged. A pot still on a trivet. Half a loaf of bread sat out, hardening. The clock on the microwave blinked 12 o'clock, as if it had recently lost power. He called for backup. End of chapter. When the team entered the home that afternoon, it was like stepping into a paused memory. Everything was still. Too still. The family's shoes were lined up by the door. Lillian's nurse ID badge hung on the key hook. Evan's homework folder was on the counter, unopened. Chloe's crayon drawing what looked like a horse with wings was still taped to the fridge. Nothing had been packed. Nothing seemed hurried. There were no signs of struggle. No broken furniture. No blood. But something was wrong. Too much was. Left behind. Wallets. IDs. Toothbrushes. Chloe's favorite stuffed rabbit. Even the dog's leash sat curled neatly on its hook. The only thing missing? The people. Ark. A search began. First the house, then the woods behind it, then the small community and beyond. Volunteers walked the logging roads, flew drones over ravines, helicopters scouted river bends. K-9 units swept the property. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of vehicle movement. The family had simply vanished. Like smoke. Media coverage was slow to pick up the story. Florence wasn't a place where stories lingered, and the sheriff's department had no firm narrative to feed the press. No ransom note. No open threats. No family history of abuse or instability. But locals remembered the tension that bloomed that summer. People whispered, "They must have run." Something about that brother of Matt's. Maybe the war messed with him. But no theory stuck. None could explain why all four would go, why nothing was taken. And no one could explain the detail that stuck with Whitlow most. The back door was locked from the inside. In the following months, leads dried up. Anonymous tips came and went. Someone thought they saw Matthew in Spokane. Another claimed to spot Lillian in Idaho. All false. The Granger family officially became Missing Persons Case Number 04, 2217. The house sat empty. No one knew what to do with it. It still smelled like them. A mix of lavender, wood smoke, and something else Whitlow could never quite place. Eventually, the property reverted to the bank. 2 years later, it was quietly listed for sale. No disclosures. No mentions of what happened there. Just a quiet rural home, priced below market. It sold within 6 days. The new owners stayed only 14 months. They claimed plumbing issues. The next stayed 3 years, then moved without leaving a forwarding address. By the time Angela Miller purchased the home in 2014, the rumors had dulled to cautionary tales. Strange energy, some said. Drafts you can't explain. Angela didn't care. She wanted quiet. She wanted space. And she wanted a fresh start. The Grangers were names in a file, until the chimney opened its mouth. How? Now, in 2020, Whitlow stood in the living room again. 16 years had passed. The couch was different, the paint new, but he could still feel it. That pause, that unanswered breath that the house seemed to hold. He examined the hearth where the dog tags had been found, and he remembered something from the original case files, something he hadn't thought about in years. During the initial search, a deputy had commented on the smell of the fireplace. "It's off," the deputy had said, "like someone burned meat in there," but they'd written it off. Nothing conclusive. No blood. No human remains. Just soot. But now, with 2 dog tags found in the flue, with Chloe's name etched into the mantel, that fireplace didn't seem like a source of warmth. It felt like a tomb. 2. Whitlow ordered a full forensic re-examination. The team began deconstructing the chimney brick by brick, starting at the flue and working downward. Every soot-covered inch was catalogued. The thermal scanner picked up something dense and irregular near the base. It was embedded behind layers of compacted ash. Carefully, the tech scraped back the residue. And then, a glint. Metallic. Oval. Another tag. This one was different. It read, Evan Granger. Typo plus. No religious preference. Rust and soot coated the edges. The metal chain was tangled around what appeared to be singed fabric, possibly from a child's shirt. And then, another fragment. Bone. Just one at first. Small. Maybe from a hand. Then more. Scattered. Mixed with ash. The lab would take weeks to confirm identities. But everyone already knew what they were holding. The house hadn't forgotten. It had remembered everything. And now, one by one, it was giving them back. End of. Whitlow stared into the fireplace as the crime scene lights bathed the room in sterile blue. He thought about the family he never got to meet, about the dinner that never finished, the bedtime story never read, the fire that may have consumed more than wood, and the silence that followed. He stepped outside into the fading light, took a breath, and looked back at the roofline. Smoke hadn't risen from that chimney in years, but something had burned here, something deep, something that had waited 16 years to be seen. I know. There was one name in the original Granger file that never quite fit. It wasn't on any lease, it didn't appear on any school forms, it didn't show up in bank statements or medical records or grocery receipts, but it came up in interviews, whispered at the edges of memory. Tom Granger, the younger brother, the one who never stayed long enough to leave a mark but always managed to leave behind a question. End of chapter. Matthew and Tom had been close once, or so the story went. Born just 2 years apart, both boys grew up on the eastern side of Washington. Their father worked the rail lines. Their mother taught Sunday school. But while Matthew stayed straight and narrow honor roll, ROTC, enlisted at 18, Tom took the longer road. Petty theft. Suspensions. A juvenile record that sealed when he turned 17. He followed Matthew into the Marines, but barely made it through boot camp. Discharged before deployment. Reasons never publicly released. By the time Matthew moved to Montana with Lillian, Tom was long gone. But according to one old neighbor, he came back briefly in the summer of 2004. A year. Detective Whitlow pulled up the original interview log. It was barely a footnote. Neighbor reports unfamiliar man in flannels seen walking up to Granger House approx. 3 days before family disappearance. Car not recognized. Possibly a visitor. No further details. No name. No description. The neighbor had moved away years ago. But Whitlow remembered something else. A single receipt. It had turned up in the original sweep of the house wedge behind a cabinet, likely fallen through a crack. A gas station receipt, time-stamped the day after the family vanished. Signed a barely legible T. Granger. It hadn't meant much back then. Could have been a fluke, a coincidence, someone else entirely. But now? Now that Chloe's dog tag had surfaced in the chimney burn, hidden Whitlow started to wonder if they'd missed the most important character of all. Firmin. He drove out to the storage facility first. It was a long shot, but one that felt worth taking. Old records from 2004, 2006 weren't digitized. But tucked in the office of the Florence Safekeep facility was a filing cabinet with yellowing carbon forms. There it was. Unit 28B. Leased for 14 months. Name Thomas G. No forwarding address. No emergency contact. But the driver's license used to sign the lease had a Spokane address an apartment building that burned down in 2007. Whitlow called the Nevada State DMV. Then Washington. Then checked with federal records. And there it was again. A name change. Not legal. Just practical. Over the next decade, Thomas Granger became Tom Graham, T. Gaither, even Thomas Gray in a few temp job files. No social security trace since 2010. Like he'd fallen off the edge of the map. R. Clay. Back at the sheriff's office, Whitlow spread the evidence over a long table. The dog tags. The melted locket. The chimney ash reports. Now the receipt. And the storage unit. Piece by piece, a different story began to emerge. One where the family didn't just vanish. One where someone came back. And then made sure they couldn't leave. Rachel Lister, a former investigative journalist, had covered the Granger disappearance in its early days. She reached out when the chimney evidence made headlines. I always thought it was someone close, she said. Strangers don't make families vanish that cleanly. Whitlow invited her to review the archive room. Together, they revisited photos from 2004, interviews, search maps. And then Rachel found something. A photo from the Dixon General Store security camera. The one that showed the Grangers shopping on the 16th of August, hours before they vanished. But this time, Rachel spotted a reflection in the freezer door. A man. Behind them, long hair, flannel. Too blurry to confirm. But enough to push Whitlow to ask for video enhancement. The techs couldn't get a face. But they could confirm. The man followed the Grangers through 2 aisles. Entered just after them. Left just before. Coincidence? Or someone watching? End quote. Then came the break. Whitlow cross-referenced old assault cases in western states under the known aliases. And there it was. A 2005 arrest in Washoe County, Nevada. Bar fight. Minor injuries. Charges dropped. But the mug shot? It matched the early photos of Tom Granger. Only older, harder, heavier, but definitely him. The arrest name? Thomas Gray. Hinduring. Whitlow called in a profiler. If Tom had returned to Florence, and if he had been responsible for the Granger family's disappearance, what would he have done next? The profiler was blunt. He would have cleaned, stayed just long enough to erase traces. He would have removed the obvious, but not everything. Because deep down, someone like that believes they're smarter than the system. And the dog tags? Likely trophies. Then guilt, then fear. So he hid them, burned them, buried them inside the home. It was symbolic, personal. Whitlow asked the hardest question. Do you think he killed them? The profiler paused. If he did, he probably didn't plan to. It started as a confrontation, maybe an argument, but when one went, the rest became witnesses. And the bodies? Not far, the profiler said. People like Tom don't plan disposal, they improvise, which means they often use what's closest. And that night, Whitlow couldn't sleep. He sat in his kitchen rereading the transcript from Lillian's last known phone call, a quick message to her sister. She'd said, Matt's been quiet, I think Tom's in town again. Kids are a little scared. She didn't elaborate. The call lasted under a minute. No one ever heard from her again. By Noor. A new search warrant was issued for the storage unit leased by Thomas G. Though long emptied and re-rented, the team brought in luminol. Traces of biological material were found in a corner behind an old pegboard, too degraded for DNA, but consistent with blood. And in the insulation, stuffed deep behind a vent grate, a scrap of children's fabric. Pink, with horses. End quote. Whitlow stood in the middle of that storage unit and thought about Chloe's drawing, the one still taped to the fridge. A horse with wings. She used to draw them everywhere, Lillian had said. Said it made her feel like the world had places left to fly. But that world had ended for the Grangers 16 years ago. And now, for the first time, Whitlow saw how. It wasn't strangers. It wasn't coincidence. It was blood. Family blood. Spilled by a name they'd tried to forget. Tom Granger didn't vanish. He hid. And now, he wasn't just a missing brother. He was a suspect. And maybe a killer. Well, the first snowfall came early that year. By the second week of October, the fields outside Florence, Montana, were already dusted with white, and the smoke from chimneys curled into the sky like fading questions. But at the Granger house, the fireplace remained cold, sealed, silent, a crime scene now. Inside, the forensic team was still cataloging every square inch. The chimney had offered secrets, but just enough to taunt. Now, it was time to listen for echoes. In a Franks, Detective Alan Whitlow stood over the spread of evidence on the conference table. Dog tags, photos, burned fabric, bone fragments. The case was no longer cold, it was volatile, emotional, politically sensitive. News outlets were circling, and worse, the community was remembering the silence, the absence, the way an entire family could vanish in the span of a dinner. Now that fragments of the truth had emerged, Whitlow needed to connect the whispers. And he needed help, too. The sheriff's department brought in fire forensics expert Dr. Helena Rita, small, wiry woman with quick eyes and a brutal clarity. She flew in from Boise, walked into the Granger house like it was speaking directly to her, and within 20 minutes said, "Someone tried to destroy something but didn't know how." She gestured to the blackened brick at the back of the hearth. Accelerant residue. Not gasoline. Something more domestic lamp oil, maybe. It didn't fully ignite. The soot pattern suggests a brief, high-heat flash and then a failure. That's why only the dog tags and fabric were scorched. He tried to burn it all. Whitlow asked the question quietly. Could it have been a body? Wright didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Maybe part of one?" They reconstructed the fireplace layer by layer. What they found, buried in ash and insulation foam, was both chilling and precise. A child's tooth, cracked at the root, likely from heat exposure. Another fragment of bonaphalanx, sized, consistent with a small hand. 3 melted coins. A blackened chain, once part of a locket. And what looked like the spine of a small notebook, badly charred, but with faint impressions still visible. A name? Etched with pencil. Afan G. End of 5. Back at the lab, forensic document examiners worked under microscopes to recover even a single word from the notebook spine. What they discovered shocked them all. A pressure impression from a missing page. A sentence carved in childlike script. "Uncle Tom is still mad." Whitlow felt the floor drop out from under him. Not only did this confirm Thomas Granger had been present, it meant the children had time to write, time to feel something coming, and to crest. At the same time, Rachel Listerth, journalist, turned Allie Doug into Tom's background. She traced him to a halfway house in Reno under the name Thomas Gray. From there, a trail of odd jobs: mechanic, groundskeeper, cook. He moved every 6 to 8 months, sometimes less. No criminal convictions since 2005, but several altercations, all sealed or settled. Then she found a phone number. Old, disconnected, but linked to a burner purchased in 2010. The name on the registration? Evan Granger. It had been used only once. A call to voicemail. Duration, 14 seconds. Message, unavailable. But the signal pinged from a tower just outside Rock Springs, Wyoming. Whitlow made the 6-hour drive himself. There was no reason to trust the lead, but he needed to feel the road beneath him. Needed to follow the ghost of the name written by a scared child into a charred notebook. He arrived in Rock Springs on a windswept morning. The town sat low against the hills, battered by snow and time. He checked local records, gas station logs, motel registries, and then something. A receipt from a hardware store dated June 2010. Item purchased. Chimney Salient. Togalons. Name on the card? T. Gray. Whitlow stared at the entry. Tom hadn't just run. He'd been chasing closure. Or trying to bury it. End of chapter. Meanwhile, the forensic team in Montana unearthed something else. A second notebook spine. This one smaller, childish. Decorated with faded Lisa Frank unicorn stickers. Chloe's. Inside, nearly every page had burned. But tucked between melted binding, they found a fragment 4 words, barely legible. He said, "Don't scream." Whitlow had heard a lot in his career, but that sentence froze him, because it wasn't just a clue. It was a whisper from the grave. The pieces were finally falling into place. Tom Granger had shown up unannounced in August 2004. There was tension. There had been arguments. Chloe had told her mother, "Uncle Tom is scary." Evan had written, "He's still mad." Somewhere between that visit and the end of dinner, something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Maybe it was confrontation. Maybe it was a break. But whatever happened, it didn't end in a clean disappearance. It ended in panic, in fire, in silence. And Tom, not knowing what to do, tried to erase it all. The rest of the bodies had never been found. But now Whitlow had a new theory. One he hadn't said aloud until Rachel asked him on record. "Do you believe the family was killed in the home?" He looked at the fireplace, then at the tiny bag that held Chloe's tooth. "I think some of them were." She waited. "And the others?" He hesitated. "Buried. Somewhere near. Or sealed inside something." Back at the house, they searched everything again. Floorboards, siding, the old tool shed. And then, behind the garage buried beneath gravel and sheet metal, they found a sealed oil drum. When they opened it, the stench was immediate. Even after 16 years, there was no mistaking it. Decomposition. Inside, remains later confirmed as Matthew and Lillian Granger. Their hands bound. Signs of blunt trauma. Beside them, a melted photo frame. Inside, a half-burned picture. Chloe and Evan arm in arm in front of a tire swing. The final clue? A fourth dog tag. Too rusted to read, but unmistakably there. 2. Whitlow stood in the yard as they carried the barrel away. The snow had started falling again. Soft, silent, relentless. The Granger house had held its secrets for 16 years. But now the ash had spoken, and the echoes were finally gone. What remained was a silence that felt honest. A silence that came after the scream. As for they always remembered the flannel. Years later, when the volunteers were asked about the stranger they saw walking near the edge of the woods that August, they didn't remember his face or his walk or even his voice, just the red and black flannel shirt. Too warm for the season, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. A threadbare collar, like it had lived through more than one kind of weather. And that's how Tom Granger began to reappear. Not as a person, but as a shape, a shirt, a shadow near the trees. Ifida. In the early days of the search for the Grangers, law enforcement fanned out in all directions, physically, mentally, emotionally. Every creek bed was examined. Every dumpster, barn, cabin. The forest west of Bristlecone Road was combed until the volunteers could name the trees by memory. One searcher, Devin McKee, remembered something odd. I saw someone walking the perimeter of the tree line, he told the detective, in 2020, after the dog tags had been found. Back then I thought it was one of us. You know, a searcher who wandered off the grid, but now... He paused, jaw tightening. I remember the shirt. Arektu. The man in the flannel had never come forward. Never signed the volunteer sheet. Never claimed to be a neighbor or family member. He was just there. For one afternoon, and then gone. But Whitlow knew better now. Tom had returned to the scene. He'd watched the chaos unfold, and he'd melted into it. And tracking a man like Tom Granger wasn't easy. He was a drifter, an alias borrower. He left no taxes, no credit cards, no digital fingerprints. But people like Tom always left something behind. A footprint, a receipt, an unfinished lead. And Rachel Lister was the first to spot the lead. Buried in a cold case forum, a user calling himself Old Dirt 72 had posted in 2014 on a thread titled, "Vanished Without a Trace, Florence Family." The comment read, "Sometimes people disappear for reasons the law won't understand. Maybe a man's got ghosts that no one else sees. Maybe he just wanted quiet." No one had responded. But Rachel ran the username through a basic search. Turns out Old Dirt 72 had posted on other forums. A fishing forum in Idaho. A prepping blog in Oregon. And once, a local swap meat board in central Utah. In that post, he listed tools for sale, garage cleanout, mostly rusted, looking to downsize. He signed it, T. Gray Salem, Ur, person sec. It was a start. Whitlow pulled property records and rental agreements. A Thomas Gray had rented a single-room outbuilding on a farmstead in Salem for just 6 weeks. Summer 2015. No criminal complaints, no incidents. But the owner remembered him clearly. He kept to himself, had that military-look disciplined, but twitchy. Never came to dinner, paid in cash. Whitlow showed him a photo from Tom's 2005 arrest. "That's him," the owner said without hesitation. M. So what had he been doing in Utah? Why Salem? The answer came from an unexpected place. A pawn shop. Just off the highway, 3 blocks from the rental, was Denny's Resale and Loan. Denny had been running the place since 1987. "I remember him," he said when Whitlow showed the photo. "He sold me a wedding ring. Said it belonged to his sister-in-law." Whitlow's blood ran cold. "Do you still have it?" Denny walked into the back room. 10 minutes later, he returned with a small velvet box. Inside was a tarnished silver band, delicate with an engraving. "Hell to Monsieur always. Lillian to Matthew." The ring had been missing since 2004. 2. For Whitlow, the ring was everything. It was proof. Tom hadn't just been there when the family vanished. Each one found at pawn shops, flea markets, storage bins. He'd scattered them like breadcrumbs through the desert. Except these weren't meant to be followed. They were meant to disappear. Profiler notes added dimension. Tom likely saw himself as both punisher and survivor, the file read. He believed the family failed him, perhaps emotionally, perhaps in a betrayal only he perceived. In his mind, the act of taking their lives wasn't just erasure. It was reclamation. That ice. Whitlow stared at the words. Punisher. Survivor. Tom hadn't run out of fear. He'd run out of grief. And rage? End of chapter. But there was still no body. No confession. No sighting in 5 years. Until the call came in. A clerk at a rest stop outside Great Falls, Montana, reported an older man in a red and black flannel buying coffee, paid in crumpled bills, asked for directions south, didn't give his name. But when he left, he forgot something. A receipt. With a note scrawled on the back, "Forgive me, I couldn't let them leave me again." And Whitlow raced north. Every county office, rest area, motel was searched. They found nothing. Tom had vanished again. But this time, they were closer than ever. Closer than the smell of smoke still etched into the Granger house walls. Closer than the ring, worn and bent, sitting in an evidence bag. Closer than Chloe's final drawing, found stuffed inside the chimney stone. A horse with broken wings. 1. In a world of digital trails and surveillance, Tom Granger had defied gravity. He became a myth. A flannel-clad silhouette fading into pine needles and bad weather. But now the myth had a pattern. And a name. And Whitlow wasn't going to stop. Not until the last ember cooled. 1. The frost came late that November, and with it, the ground stiffened like it had something to hide. The Granger property sat silent on the edge of Florence, Montana. Snow clung to the weeds. The barn leaned at a tired angle. But beneath that ordinary silence, the land held something more. Something unfinished. Something shallow. Detective Alan Whitlow stood in the back field, wind biting at his face, and stared down at the open soil. He had come here countless times over the past 16 years. But now, for the first time, he wasn't looking for the missing. He was looking for what had been buried. I abstain. It had started with a drone. After the discovery of Lillian and Matthew's remains in the sealed oil drum, Whitlow ordered a new round of ground-penetrating radar surveys. Technology had advanced since 2004. The soil could tell a story it hadn't been able to tell before. And this time, it did. The scan revealed a rectangular anomaly just past the tree line 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, about 5 feet down. A disturbance in compacted earth, not from a tree root or a boulder. This was man-made. The excavation crew began at dawn. The earth was stubborn, thick with years of growth and frostbite. But 6 feet in, they struck something unnatural. A plastic tarp, ripped at the edges. Beneath it, decaying boards. And then, bone. Small, fragile, child-sized. They uncovered a partial skeleton later identified through dental records as Chloe Granger, folded in a fetal position, hands still bound with frayed rope. Beside her, a singed backpack. Inside, melted crayons, a cracked unicorn hair clip, and a drawing. It was barely legible, but the title remained. My house is not safe. C. The site was sealed immediately. Forensics moved in. Whitlow stood at the edge and watched the crew uncover each layer of the earth, and with it the timeline of a little girl's final day. The rope was synthetic. The knots were tight. She had not died instantly. The medical examiner would later confirm blunt force trauma to the head. But more telling was the angle of her arm's defensive wounds. She had fought. And somewhere above this place, her killer had stood and watched the dirt swallow the secret hole. R2, the news broke across the region like a second winter. The Granger family was no longer just missing. They were victims. And now, even those who had once held back came forward. Neighbors remembered strange sounds in the woods that week, a muffled scream, a car door slamming, the rumble of tires at 3 a.m. One man recalled seeing a figure dragging something through the grass under a tarp. I thought it was a deer, he admitted, voice cracking. It was moving funny, like he was trying not to be seen. With Chloe's remains confirmed, Whitlow refocused his efforts on Evan, the last missing member of the Granger family. But there were no leads, no bodies, no clues, until a fire crew from Missoula stumbled onto something. But they were training in a remote sector of Lolo National Forestan area, overgrown and long forgotten. One of the rookies stepped into a shallow pit and twisted his ankle. Beneath the pine needles and brush, they found something smooth. Metal. A box. It was rusted shut. They turned it over to police. Inside, a photograph. Water, damaged, but visible. 2 kids on a tire swing. Evan and Chloe. Taped to the back was a note. He didn't cry, just stared at me. I couldn't, so I let him go. No signature, but the ink was the same type found in the Granger home. End quote. Was it real? Had Evan survived? Or was this another of Tom's games? The forensics team ran the box for DNA. It came back inconclusive traces of multiple profiles, most too degraded to match. But the photo, it had been printed at a local drugstore chain in 2004. And the handwriting? Consistent with a journal entry recovered from Tom's old storage unit. The implication was staggering. If true, Evan may have lived, even if only for a little while longer. Rachel Lister flew to Salt Lake City to track down a possible sighting. In 2005, a woman had reported a boy walking alone along Route 89 near the Arizona border. Dirty, silent, holding a stuffed dog. The woman pulled over, but the boy bolted into the trees. A report was filed. No follow-up. But now it was reclassified. A potential witness. Whitlow reviewed the files late into the night. What kind of man could kill his brother and sister-in-law, beat a child to death, and then take one with him? Why Evan? Why spare him? Or had he? The profiler offered a possibility. Tom may have seen something of himself in the boy. Maybe Evan didn't resist. Maybe he connected to someone like Tom that might have been enough to hesitate. But in the end, these stories always return to control. If Evan survived, he didn't escape. He was released. He issued a warrant for Thomas Granger, alias Thomas Gray, for the murder of Lillian and Matthew Granger and the abduction and likely homicide of Chloe and Evan Granger. The manhunt began in earnest. Posters, news bulletins, Interpol alerts, and a name on the FBI's most wanted list. For the first time in 16 years, Tom Granger was not just a memory. He was a fugitive. Chapter 3. Then came the voicemail. A call placed to Rachel Lister's burner number. No caller ID. Just static. And then a voice. Raspy. Low. You dug too deep. The past ain't meant to be unburied. Let the earth keep what it took. Click. No trace. No ping. But it was him. Rachel knew it. And so did Whitlow. End of chapter. The search wasn't over. Evan was still out there, maybe alive, maybe a ghost. And Tom? Tom had become the wind. But wind can shift. Ash can rise. And sometimes the shallow earth gives up the deepest truth. End of chapter. It began with a face. Not in a dream. Not in a memory. But on a grainy CCTV clip from a bus depot in Butte, Montana captured at 3:41 a.m., 1 month after the FBI issued its warrant for Thomas Granger. There, walking past the camera in a blurred frame of motion, was a man in a faded red and black flannel shirt, gray beard, worn boots, and in his right hand a duffel bag that sagged like it held something old and heavy. Detective Alan Whitlow paused the video on frame 327. It wasn't a clear match. But the shape of the shoulders, the gait, the shirt, Whitlow knew. It was him. Tom had returned. I was went. Butte was a city of edge-of-steel bones, shuttered windows, sharp wind. It was where railcars rested and drifters vanished. A place Tom could blend in. The video showed him buying a one-way ticket. Destination: Lewiston, Idaho. A town near the Snake River. Borderland. Whitlow was on the road within the hour. I was went. The Lewiston bus depot was empty by the time he arrived. The clerk barely remembered the man in flannel. Said he was visiting someone, she offered. Didn't say who, just walked off toward the bridge. The Snake River Bridge ran west, curving like a scar through old timberland. And just past the bridge sat a motel, the Clearwater Inn, half-lit and quiet. Room 6 was signed to a Thomas Gray. Whitlow didn't wait. He knocked. Once, twice, then he heard it. Footsteps, a rustle, and a voice. Didn't think you'd come alone. Say. Whitlow pushed in. The room was dim, curtains drawn. The air smelled like rust and old wood. And there, sitting at the small table, was Thomas Granger. Older, gaunter, but unmistakable. He raised his hand slowly. No gun, Alan. Not anymore. Whitlow stared at him. You killed them. Tom didn't flinch. I tried to save what I could. What does that mean? Tom looked away. It means I failed. Say, they sat for 40 minutes. No handcuffs yet. Just two men, one burned by guilt, the other by 16 years of buried bones. Tom talked, and what he said shifted everything. He claimed the killings hadn't been planned. He said Matthew and Lillian confronted him about money, about old family wounds, about what he'd done during his deployment. There was yelling. Tom said. Chloe screamed. Evan stood there holding her hand like he was her protector. Tom's hands trembled. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just snapped. And he confessed to striking Matthew with a wrench, to binding Lillian when she tried to run, to locking Chloe in the crawlspace just until I could think. She didn't make it out. But Evan was different. He didn't run. He just watched. I think he was waiting for me to explain. Tom broke down then. Said he couldn't kill the boy. Said he took him. Tried to raise him under a new name. They lived in trailers, shelters, woods for nearly 2 years. Until one day, Evan left, slipped out while Tom was asleep, and never came back. End quote. Whitlow couldn't believe it. "You expect me to believe Evan's alive?" "I don't expect anything," Tom said. "But he was, once. I gave him my jacket, the one you've been chasing all this time." End quote. Back at the station, Tom wrote a full statement. He drew maps, named the remote sites where he claimed to have lived with Evan. But there was a catch. No records, no sightings, no photos, and no remains. Was this remorse? Or another manipulation? Still, Whitlow followed the trail. He and a search team hiked into the Wallowa Mountains, northeast Oregon, where Tom said he and Evan stayed in 2006. At the base of a ravine, they found the remains of a small shelter-rotted planks, old food wrappers. And carved into one beam, nearly worn away, E plus T equals nowhere. When they knew that night, Whitlow stared at the carving. Nowhere. Was it a location? A state of mind? Or just a final echo of a boy trying to survive? They didn't find Evan, but they found his drawing sealed in a weatherproof folder. A cabin, a man, a boy, a river, and in the corner one phrase: "I miss Mom. Payole." Tom Granger pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. He refused a trial, refused a lawyer, said only this: "I buried them in silence. I'll carry them in silence." He was sentenced to life without parole and vanished into the federal system, just like he always did. But the mystery wasn't over, because Evan was still missing. If alive, he'd be 27 now. And somewhere out there, a man walks alone, carrying the weight of the flannel, the screams of a sister, and the silence of a boy who once stood still while the world around him broke. There's a smell to burned memory. Not just smoke, but something more. A presence, a pressure. The way air changes when truth is pulled from dirt and ruin. In the final weeks of the Granger case, that smell lingered in every file, every photo, every sleepless hour Detective Alan Whitlow spent at his desk. The story was supposed to be over. The killer had confessed. The bodies had been found. But something still hung in the air unspoken, because Evan was still missing, and the ashes hadn't given everything back. And the town of Florence moved on slowly. The Granger property, now cordoned and condemned, sat quiet on the edge of a frostbitten field. Locals passed it without looking. Children whispered about it in the schoolyard. Some called it haunted. Others simply avoided it. But to Whitlow, the place was still alive. Not with ghosts, with questions. And one morning, 6 months after Tom Granger's sentencing, one more answer came. It arrived by mail. No return address. A small padded envelope marked only with Whitlow's name in block letters. Inside, a blackened locket, melted slightly, warped by fire. Inside the locket, 2 tiny photographs so faded they were barely visible, but one unmistakably showed Chloe Granger. The other, a boy's profile, partially obscured. And scratched into the back of the locket a new message: "He walks west. End of Clow." That phrase reignited the investigation. Forensic testing showed the envelope had been mailed from Northern California. The DNA on the seal? Partial match to Thomas Granger. But Tom was already in federal custody. So who mailed it? A copycat? An accomplice? Or Evan? Enough. Rachel Lister returned to the case with renewed urgency. She traced sightings of young men using the name Evan Thomas along the western rail routes, Eugene, Portland, Sacramento. All inconclusive. But then came a break. In Crescent City, a social worker reported a man who'd come to a soup kitchen. Mid-20s. Quiet. Said his name was E. Asked for nothing but a clean shirt and a place to warm up. left behind a sketchbook. The pages were filled with charcoal drawings, trees, rivers, faces. One of them was unmistakable. Chloe. Hendry. Whitlow drove out personally. The sketchbook was in the office safe, untouched. He flipped through it slowly, each image more heartbreaking than the last. A tire swing, a hand holding another in the dark, a girl with her mouth stitched shut, and finally, a crude drawing of a fire chimney, flames twisting into words. I remember everything. End of. For weeks, Whitlow worked with state and federal agents to follow the trail. One tip led to a nature preserve outside Mendocino, another to a coastal library in Eureka. Always a step behind, always too late. But then, a ranger near Fort Bragg found something, tucked inside the hollow of an old pine tree. A sealed envelope. No postage. Inside, a single Polaroid. A young man seated on driftwood, looking toward the sea. Long hair, beard, weathered face. But the eyes, unmistakable. It was Evan. And they canvassed the area, sent dive teams along the shoreline. Dogs, drones, nothing. It was as if Evan had been there, just long enough to leave a whisper, and then moved on. End. Whitlow returned to the Granger property one last time. It was spring now. The frost had receded. Grass was trying to grow. He walked the perimeter slowly, past the old oil drum, past the tree where Chloe's drawing had been found, up to the chimney, now bricked over. He knelt beside it and placed the locket down on the hearth. He walks west, he said aloud. If you're out there, I hope you're walking free. End quote. In the final weeks of the investigation, authorities officially declared Evan Granger a missing person but no longer presumed dead. A new file was opened. A new photo distributed. A new hope stirred. B. Rachel released a podcast episode documenting the entire case. It spread across the country. Thousands of listeners reached out. Some claimed to have seen Evan. Others simply wrote, "Tell him he's not forgotten." One message stood out. An anonymous email sent to the station. Subject line: I am not my past. Body: thank you for looking. I still hear her laugh sometimes in the trees. That's enough. For now. End quote. And that is where the story sits. Not wrapped in ribbon. Not solved. But illuminated. A father, mother, daughter all laid to rest. A brother alive, maybe, or a ghost shaped by survival. A killer imprisoned, and a town no longer silent. End quote. Sometimes, justice doesn't come in the form of answers. Sometimes it's in the echo of a child's drawing, the outline of a swing set beneath snow, or the burnt edges of a chimney that finally gave up its truth. The ashes never forget. And sometimes, they give back what we thought was lost forever. And